So good afternoon everyone and welcome to ISG's Smart Series webinar, where today we'll be discussing the Sustainable Buildings Monitor. I'm Richard Hubbard, Chief Marketing Officer at ISG, and today we'll be exploring how ready we are across the UK to chart a net zero legacy for our cities, our towns and our communities. So a quick introduction to ISG. We're an international construction services company and we specialise in fit out, where we're leaders in office and retail sectors. We also have an engineering services business that builds hyperscale projects, particularly data centres and high-tech manufacturing facilities. And we have a general construction business that builds for both the private and public sectors. So while the world remains focused on finding a pathway out of the pandemic, there is, of course, another long-standing global crisis, and that's the issue of climate change and how we create a sustainable future for our planet. And on this topic, the eyes of the world will turn towards the UK when the government here hosts the UN Climate Change Conference of the Parties Summit, which I'm sure you will all know as COP26 in Glasgow this November. So what we're finding at ISG is a large number of our clients have made some really bold commitments to improve their performance, and without a doubt, the property and construction sector has a huge role to play. In fact, a quarter of the global CO2 emissions come from buildings. So transforming the energy efficiency of our buildings is going to be critical if we're going to cut the level of energy consumption we need to reach net zero. So we believe that collaboration is the only way to solve this shared responsibility. To help the property and construction sector in stepping up to the challenge, we've commissioned a research and insight report, which we call the Sustainable Buildings Monitor. This report uses data to understand the regional variations in the carbon emissions and energy consumption due to the operation of commercial buildings in the UK. So before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to take a minute or two to explain a bit about the research that we've commissioned. So the Sustainable Buildings Monitor is really in two parts. There's an emission intensity index that reflects emissions performance by region, and an energy intensity index, which highlights energy consumption. So two things: emissions performance, energy consumption. These indices are derived from publicly available information published by the BEIS, and the report effectively flags where there's most work to do. And that could be sector, it could be geography, but it really helps to put the focus on where we can have the most impact. It also highlights some of the innovative things that are being done. There's some great work going on in the construction sector and the property sector to tackle the problems that we have, and it kind of helps to see where we are on the readiness scale. So before we kick off, please a reminder to submit your questions via the chat facility on the right of your screen. We'll do our best to answer all the questions, but we had hundreds of you register to attend today, and we may not get to all of them in the session. Please contact us afterwards, we'll be delighted to speak to you. So enough from me, let's meet the panel. They're all experts in their own field. And firstly, I'd like to say hi to Alistair Mant. Hi, Alistair.
Hi there, Richard. Thanks for having me on the panel today.
Delighted to have you. Alistair is the Director of Business Transformation at the UK Green Building Council and leads the scoping and delivery of collaborative projects which provide the built environment sector with the tools and the guidance it needs to radically improve the sustainability of the built environment. And I guess in line with this, the UK Green Building Council has released its Net Zero Carbon Buildings Framework, and that's designed to provide clarity and guidelines for the construction sector on how to reduce its carbon emissions by 2050. Our second panelist is Jane Wakiwaka. Hi, Jane. Hi, Jane. Hopefully.
Yes, sorry, it took me a while to unmute. Nice to be here today. Thanks for having me.
So thanks so much for joining us. Jane is the head of sustainability at the Crown Estate and leads and manages sustainability, as you'd expect, stewardship and innovation across the operational assets and development projects of the business. If that wasn't enough, Jane also sits on the Better Buildings Partnership Board of Directors and is also chair of the GRESB's European Benchmark Committee, where she sits on the advisory board. Now, the third member of our panel is Matthew Alshout. Hi, Matthew. Hi.
Hi, Richard. Very nice to be here today.
Okay. Thanks for joining. Matthew is Head of Sustainability and Impact Investing at Patrizia, where he has the overall responsibility for sustainable and impact fund strategies. And before this, he was Senior Investment Director at PGGM, where he was responsible for a portfolio of European private real estate investments, as well as leading PGGM's efforts on sustainability within real estate. And then completing our panel, a valued colleague of mine is ISG's very own Debbie Hobbs. Debbie is Director of Sustainable Business for ISG. Hi, Debbie. Debbie, you there? You may be on mute.
Hi, Richard. Glad to be here today.
All right, great, thank you. Debbie's a building physicist at heart, and Debbie is, and I work with Debbie, incredibly passionate about making buildings that work for both people and for the planet. And before her work at ISG, obviously Debbie's had various roles. She's been a client, a consultant, now a contractor, and Debbie's seen all of the aspects of the building life cycle, and she believes, I know, that the rhetoric now needs to very quickly be converted into action if we're going to meet our target. So to my panel and to everyone that's registered, the audience, thank you for joining us today. So we'll get into the questions, but first of all, Debbie, if it's all right with you, I'd just like to ask you to summarise the findings of our report.
Yes, sure. Thanks, Richard, and afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I'm just going to spend a few minutes reviewing the definition of net zero in order to explain why we think it was so important to do this research, which is trying to throw some transparency on the current energy and carbon performance of our commercial building stock. So being a building physicist, as Richard said, I find it amazing that after 33 years in sustainability, we finally got world leaders talking about the need for better environmental policy. But forgive me if I'm a little bit cynical. I can remember Gordon Brown in 2006 saying all new homes will be carbon neutral by 2016 in the UK. So we didn't quite get there. And so what do we have to do now differently in order to make sure we get it right this time? To get the roadmap and the pathway really settled, we need two things. Firstly, we need to know where we're going. And there's great work by the UK GBC, which is actually helping chart where we need to get to. The other thing we need to know, which is why we've done this research, is where we're starting from. With those two factors, I think as an industry, we can work collaboratively together and actually innovate and find the best way to get there. So looking at where we're aiming to go first, the great work done by the UK GBC has set this out quite neatly. In 2050, in the UK, there is a prediction for how much renewable energy we will have on the electricity grid. And that's the orange line you can see on the graph. What we also know is the pink line. That charts where we are today in terms of energy use and where we need to get to match the renewable energy in the UK by 2050. And let's not forget, everything we do in terms of energy in 2050 will have to come from renewables, because in a carbon neutral world, there are no carbon offsets to buy. So we have to be using truly zero carbon energy at that point. And for those who are quick at maths, it might look like it's only 60%, but let's not forget, we've got to add in other sectors to that electricity grid, particularly transport and also some large industrial processes which currently use fossil fuels. So moving on to the next slide, let's just have a look at the definitions of zero carbon. There's lots of discussions about zero carbon, and it often means different things to different people. This is a whole life carbon cycle of a building, and it gets quite complicated, and we do have lots of software to help us model it. At ISG, we use something called OneClick to look at whole life carbon versus whole life cost. And increasingly, clients are asking us to do that. Going across from left to right, we've got the embodied carbon. That's the embodied carbon that's used in materials. So the energy and that's used in producing materials and transporting it to site. Then we've got the energy that we actually use during the construction process. So part of our challenge at ISG is, can we build buildings in a carbon neutral way going forward? Those first two are often labelled as construction carbon, or the cost of the carbon in construction. The other three is where the challenge really begins in my mind. Yes, we're delivering and designing and building zero carbon buildings, but they are only zero carbon if somebody operates them and maintains them throughout their life cycle to be zero carbon, and use that slice of energy on the grid which they can have going forward. And we mustn't forget that there's also carbon in maintenance, fit out and refurbishment. And equally, if a product is going to be disposed of more readily at the end of its life, there's carbon in even recycling products. So the best products are ones that we can reuse. So can we assemble buildings, disassemble them, and reuse the material from project to project? So today we're primarily going to be looking at the operational performance of buildings. And moving on to the next slide, the research we have done has taken, as Richard said, the energy consumption across UK sectors from BEIS and the floor area from the Valuation Office database to look at what the average energy use already is of our commercial buildings in the UK. We've had to remove the large industrial sector because that was skewing the data from region to region. And I must say, I was really surprised that we then got to a range which looked very plausible for actual commercial building energy use. We're ranging from about 236 to 370 kilowatt hours per metre squared. So that's where we're starting on our journey, an average of 284 kilowatt hours per metre squared. And what we know we've got to get to is between 55 and 70 kilowatt hours per metre squared. So that is roughly an 80% reduction in the energy use of all commercial buildings in the UK. And if we click the next figure on this slide, what we also know is that we've only got 10,462 days to get there. Now, this might look like a long time, but when you think of all the commercial buildings in the UK and the fact that to get an 80% reduction, we not only need to operate more efficiently and not only just replace all the HVAC systems, which would get you to 40 or 50%, to get to that 80%, we've got to make sure that all the fabric of buildings is upgraded. And that's a much bigger challenge, and that they're airtight going forward. But the good news is, to end on a good note, is that we know how to do this. We have the techniques and we have the processes to do it. What we really need is the action plans for people to actually start getting their portfolios into a routine where this can be continually upgraded. So on that note, I'm going to hand back to Richard.
Great, Debbie, thanks very much. Let's get into some questions for the panel then. And it's clear to me that that timeline is obviously compressing as every day passes, and this is only going to increase the kind of pressure. So I think if I open up the discussion, my first question to the panel would be, how do we drive the radical change that's clearly needed in terms of behaviour to realise that net zero carbon future? And I think if I direct that to you, Matthew, to start off with.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. I'm happy to comment on that. So I think for radical change, you need many players in the whole real estate industry, I would say, to start there. And I would first look to the large investors or investors in general, like my former employer PGM. Investors like that, they have been working on this or towards this for quite some time already. First, by starting to improve ESG in general, to integrate ESG in general, but they have very much come aware of climate change in the last years, and very much focused nowadays on the physical and transition risk, what we're discussing here, derived from climate change. So I think we need to play with the investors and work with the investors. They already understand it, and they are putting pressure on the whole chain to further improve. Another factor I think is very important is what I see happening is that regulators and supervisory bodies, they also play a very important role. And this year only, I believe there are 18 central banks all over the world running climate transition stress tests. So that's the Central Bank of Japan, Australia, ECB. So what they are after is to what extent are investors exposed to carbon? The higher the carbon footprint, the higher risk. And one thing I have learned in the past, say, 10 years with an investor, risk is, top priority. So this risk will have to be managed by them. I also see the governments stepping up their efforts. So when it comes to radical change, I think momentum is needed, and I do see that momentum is definitely building up today, but I am afraid it has to increase even further to really see that radical change. And if it doesn't happen in this way, and in that sense markets would fail, I'm afraid then governments have to step up their efforts, and there will have to come in more penalties or bonuses to further improve and decrease the carbon footprints.
Yeah, understood. So collaboration clearly key, and public sector, private sector collaboration absolutely key. I think, Alistair, maybe if I come to you, it would be interesting to get that kind of that overview that you have as a body at UKGBC.
Yeah, hi, thanks, Richard. I don't disagree with any of the suggestions so far either, but I suppose from my point of view, I use the rule of three. So I think corporate and government commitments, secondly, robust data, and thirdly, individual desire. So, we need corporate and government commitments which are commensurate with the scale of the challenge, and it is an immense challenge. It really is huge, the changes we've got to make in this decade. So those are individual initiatives, pieces of legislation, in fact, as Matthew mentioned as well. And there's a big movement this year with COP around this idea of an ambition loop. So if governments set these big targets out, then actually we're seeing corporates step up to that, try and go further. That's then pushing government, it's giving them that confidence that, okay, we've got the backing of business, actually we can go a little bit further, because we know that these commitments are sort of the minimum we need to do to actually reach that challenge. So I think corporate and government commitments is one. What we're doing at UKGBC on that is, for the first time, we've actually brought in a member requirement that for all our Gold Leaf members, they need to join the Race to Zero, which again is part of this push for corporate commitments towards COP in November, and that all our other business members must have at least some form of a corporate commitment to climate action. If you haven't got that far on the journey, you're kind of not in the game. We're not sure how we're going to be able to help you achieve it. Secondly, robust data. Really, really crucial, huge challenge. We need to identify where to spend our time, where to allocate our capital to. So is it different types of materials that are used, different processes, different types of buildings that are more energy inefficient? Who are the stakeholders that we need to spend time and money with? And we need that robust data. And so this report is a really, really helpful step towards that. And thirdly, something I'm really passionate about, and in fact that we do a lot of work at UKGBC on, is around that individual desire. This is no longer just the role of the sustainability manager or sustainability consultant. It's got to come into everyone's job spec, into everyone's role, again, as Matthew was saying. And So I think we need to get comfortable as individuals and professionals asking difficult questions. Yeah, of ourselves. Why are we doing those things? Can we do it differently? Of our suppliers, of our clients? We've got to get really into that collaborative spirit. We've got to act as that peloton, learning together, getting through those challenges, identifying solutions. We need brave leadership then to go off the front of that peloton, make a dash for the front, but then we need them to pass us back those learnings, and we need to catch up, and we need someone else to go and take that next drive. And then finally, we need to get really comfortable with embracing change, and that's not something we're good at. You know, we're a very risk-averse industry, and there's lots of facts about that, and there's lots of very good reasons for it. But what we're talking about here in the scale of the challenge is fundamental change, and we need to learn as individuals and organisations how to be ready to embrace that.
Yeah, absolutely. Certainly, from where I sit, Alistair, you know, you can feel the change, and the level of discussion at the boardroom is completely different to it was, you know, only a couple of years ago. It's completely different. Maybe Jane, just if I come to you in terms of what we need to do to make that radical shift.
Sure, thanks, Richard. I mean, I would actually echo a lot of what both Alice and Matteo have said already. And I think, firstly, from my end as a landlord developer perspective, is that we do have to recognise as an industry that there's a huge amount of disruption that's happening, which includes the fact that, you know, we're seeing huge societal shifts and expectations around how companies and organisations and governments respond to the climate change and net zero agenda. And I think, you know, and that's one of the disruptions. I think, you know, we've got technological disruptions. If you see everything that's happened in the last year, you know, how do we make sure that real estate as a sector remains relevant, and that we don't actually become obsolescent as well? I do think that it's incredibly important to have the right sort of government policies and interventions, but I also think that it's really important that we lead by example, and we can't just wait for policies and legislation to come forward. We need to be, as an industry, driving this forward. And again, just to echo what others have said around collaboration, that is going to be incredibly important. We are all facing really similar challenges as an industry. So how do we come together to solve some of these challenges? I think Alistair mentioned the Race to Zero, which we're a part of. There's also, you know, other sort of great initiatives that are out there, like the BBP Climate Change Agreement that we joined up to as part of our net zero commitment, and also great stuff around things like the launch of the Neighbours rating, which was an industry-led initiative, which was really looking at design for performance as opposed to moving away from that design for compliance. I also wanted to just kind of pick up on Alistair's point around the fact that this is a collective responsibility, and certainly as somebody that sits in the sustainability team, it's not our role to deliver it. This is something that as across the business, we all have an individual responsibility and action. And what I would also say is that I'd echo that with our supply chain as well. I think often the finger can get pointed to the client and say, and you know, whether the client has a commitment, etc., which I do think is really important, and obviously we have that responsibility. But I also would encourage the supply chain to also challenge, you know, where you do have clients that aren't as actively engaged. You know, I think we all have that responsibility to challenge right up that supply chain, as well as clients articulating what we want and expect from our supply chain as well.
Great, yeah. So I'm definitely hearing that kind of getting ahead of legislation theme, and also that collaboration right across the life cycle, from the planning through to the operation and beyond. So, Debbie, anything you'd like to add on the radical change we need to make?
I think to Alistair's point, particularly about individuals, that's why we've launched at ISG our 4 new policies about carbon, circular economy, social value and environment. And it's about rolling it out to the whole business now, so that all our teams know how to construct and deliver net zero carbon buildings, but also about ownership as well. So that we own in the industry collaboratively as design teams and construction companies the performance of buildings. As you know, Richard, we're starting to monitor some of our existing buildings, particularly the ones where we've got net zero carbon commitments, so that we monitor them remotely and start helping the occupants of the buildings actually achieve net zero in operation. Because although we can deliver these buildings as an industry, especially in new buildings, can occupants actually operate and maintain them? And how do we ensure they've got the information and the technology in their building to be able to do that? So it's looking at the whole building, not only the design and construction, but also techniques for operating for me.
Absolutely, yeah, that's definitely a live challenge that we're looking at right now. So I guess that brings me on to my second question, which is really around reducing energy consumption. So that's got to be a universal driver for the sector. But the scale of the challenge and the opportunities obviously vary significantly, as our report will reveal. So how do we ensure that all sectors are guided on their pathway to net zero? And I think, Alistair, if I can come back to you with that question first.
Absolutely. I mean, I kind of want to come up with something that just disagrees with what any of us have said, because we're all far too much in agreement. So maybe somebody could disagree with what I'm about to say, because I'm still on track with comments so far. But yeah, it's partly about that collaboration piece again. So I think we really need to agree definitions. What do we mean by net zero? What are the end goals? So some of those specifics that actually Debbie showed that we've been working on at UK GBC, but we need that for across the sector. And what is the route to get there? It's no good saying, oh, 2050 we're going to be net zero, or 2040. I mean, we need action now. So we need things. We need a pathway to it, and we need to know how we're going to measure that progress as the data bit. So we're putting a lot of focus on that. As ever, everything we do is really about bringing the industry together and trying to form a consensus and a clear vision forward. So one of the main things that I sort of ask everyone to try and get involved in, and certainly look out for when we publish it in November at COP, is the whole life carbon roadmap for the UK built environment. I think we're correct in saying it's the largest collaboration ever of UK built environment organisations in terms of working on low carbon and climate change. And it's going to be mapping out that trajectory for residential, non-residential and infrastructure built assets to 2050. So there's that kind of quantitative side, but there's also the more qualitative, which is equally as important, which is actually from the stakeholders who needs to do what and by when. So that includes looking at things like skills and training as well, and the role of regulation and the role of business. Secondly, as Debbie kindly mentioned at the start, is since 2019 we've been leading this development of the net zero carbon buildings definition framework, and plugging on more things like performance targets for offices. We're going to be continuing that in conjunction with the findings of the whole life carbon roadmap. That's going to be setting that new foundation, which we can then essentially have to draw down on for the specific real estate asset types, in terms of both on the embodied targets, but also on the energy efficiency performance targets. And then what we're hearing a massive groundswell and clamour for from industry, and it might be interesting to get Jane's views on this as a probable end user, is actually a verification scheme around net zero. Lots of people are trying to do it now. I know we need a little bit more information in terms of things like performance targets to really make it robust. But we're working with other organisations across the industry and our members, lots of developers, owners, to actually try and identify what is it that the industry wants in terms of let's think about certification, a badge for net zero buildings, and then what's the process for making that work. So hopefully that's kind of, maybe we can have a discussion about that, about whether that's good or not, and let's get some disagreement going. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Absolutely. Well, Jane, I think Alistair teed you up there probably, so I'll invite you to give your view.
Sure. I mean, I'm not going to, Alistair, unfortunately, I'm not going to disagree with what you've said. But what I will say is that from a certification front, I do think that it is important to have some way of robustly being able to say what is a net zero carbon building. I think the challenge that we'll have is that if we don't have something sort of robust that we can independently sort of hang our hat on, there's just a danger that people will go out there and credit and claim that they're achieving net zero carbon when they're not necessarily. So I think would definitely from that landlord developer kind of perspective, I think it would be very much welcome. What I would say is, as a caveat, is that we need to have the right sort of benchmarks and data to make sure that we're sort of accurately measuring what we mean by net zero carbon. I think things like Part L isn't going to be the way forward. So things like how does neighbours, etc., kind of get included. And I think I would also say that I would welcome an opportunity to sort of rationalize a number of certification schemes, etc., that are out there as well, because there just seems to be quite a large proliferation. The other thing that I did kind of want to mention is that I think the trajectory point I think is really, really important and useful to have. But what I would say is that when we set out our own net zero carbon commitment, we didn't actually go out there with that trajectory already developed, and we kind of accepted that while we will necessarily need to have that trajectory, we don't have all of the answers today. And I think it's important that we kind of operate in the space to allow innovation to happen as well. Is that we don't need to have all of the answers, but we just need to crack on and start actually doing stuff around energy reduction. And I think on that point, what I really want to highlight, especially when we're looking at operational energy, is that we are kind of creating destinations for people and for our occupiers to actually occupy the spaces, and we have to make sure that we've included them as part of the conversation. And I think as a landlord, we have a real opportunity to really engage with our customers, with our occupiers, in a very different way to how we have done in the past. And I think for us to really reduce energy meaningfully, we have to think about how we partner and how we support and work with customers in a very, very different way. I think the other thing is that as a developer, we do have access to all manners of other sectors as well. So again, there's a real opportunity to work with sectors in terms of, again, how we source and procure right across our supply chain, whether it's goods or services. So I think some really good opportunities for how we can sort of engage with other sectors beyond specifically real estate.
Great, thank you, Jane. And definitely in the Sustainable Buildings Monitor report, there's some really great examples of the innovations that are happening right now. There's some good stuff that is happening out there, but I'm hearing this sort of need for a common data set, less complication, something that we can all understand and buy into and use for benchmarking. So if I come to you, Matthew, I guess we're at a sort of really interesting point from a kind of funding and perspective and emerging out of COVID-19. So it'd be good to get your views.
Yeah, let me start by coming back to the challenges that we referred to before. And so the challenges are there for every sector. I wouldn't want to pick out one of the sectors within real estate specifically, but I would also like to stress here, knowing that we've got a lot of UK people here in this call, that it's not only about the UK. UK is definitely, I find, very much ahead if I compare it to many other countries. But what would be helpful for a common understanding, a global common understanding, is that we do have global pathways, of course, for every individual country, but in the same way for all countries really available. And I think that's why I've been very supportive in the past on the initiative, what is referred to as the Carbon Risk Real Estate Monitor, the CREM initiative, which has developed pathways for all over the world for all sectors, which can then be used by global investors, but of course also by local investors to refer to. And I think whether it's a UK Green Building Council pathway or a CREM pathway, it should be more or less all the same, so to say, and it should be a common language that enables that whole industry, the investors at least, to compare the assets they are holding onto to the pathways and see and witness the stranding risk in their portfolio. So that would be really helpful. We at Proticia, we're working our way through our portfolio as well, but it's a 1,400 assets portfolio that we're managing, and it's a challenge, I have to say, to get accurate data in for all of our assets. One reason for that, and that is a challenge, and maybe to address here as well, is that as a landlord, you don't always get your hands on the data because it's controlled by the tenant. And there I would also really call for action that, and I believe, there are already steps into that direction, but it should be possible to always get your hands on that data, whether it's, you know, in a black box or whatever, but that should be possible. And there are still very large players, tenants, for example, in e-commerce, that are just not willing to provide, you know, data on their energy use. So how can we then, as a landlord, further improve that building without knowing its exact carbon footprint? So I think that is very key. And one more thing we have to do as fund managers is convince all of our investors what to do, because not all investors already see the need for it. Sometimes more have a wait and see approach and think more on, okay, what is the cash on cash return of this asset today? Everything I would spend on it today would eat into that cash on cash return. I don't think that is well, there are many ways, of course, to look at return for an asset, but it's definitely a risky one, I would say, where you don't take into account the capex that has to be spent in the future. So we should advise our investors that they do take that into consideration. I hope that addresses your question, Richard.
Great. And Debbie, just coming to you, obviously the original question was around particular challenges in particular sectors, and Matthew's kind of saying it's across the piece, which I get, and it's global. And I'm pleased to say the next iteration of the Sustainable Buildings Monitor will be a global piece, so hopefully that will help. But either on the original question, Debbie, or just react to anything that the other panelists said, and I know you're very passionate about the thing Matthew said around you know, monitoring the performance of buildings and getting data. Is there anything you want to add?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think to try and sort of follow on Alistair's theme of being a bit radical, what I think we need to do is change the way we contract in the buildings industry, especially new buildings. So we can be really innovative, but we need the you know, sort of environment to do it in. So why don't we change contracts to deliver on performance, not whether we've actually put a building up in time and it's health and safe, but why not pay us when the building performs? She says radically, as a part of the construction industry. But what happens at the moment is nobody's really interested in performance. The people who've constructed the building and designed it leave at the point of handover and often don't get to go back and see performance, and sometimes don't want to be brutally honest. And when we commission buildings, we're checking that the meters are there, but we don't check they're working because nobody's looking at performance. So one of my radical cries would be, let's change the industry a bit so that we're all focusing on performance. And we've all got a bit of like skin in the game, as everybody keeps calling it, to ensure that building operates for the occupants. To Matthew's point about landlords and tenants, we both know that's one of the most difficult issues. But we do have technology today. Metering is really cheap and sensors are cheap. And I know we can't always do it because of leases and contractual issues, but the more we can get technology into buildings that allows us to monitor them, the better. And what we're certainly doing for some owner-occupier buildings, particularly schools, is putting in a lot of sensors and monitoring equipment so that we can always have access to that data. And if they come back to us in 6 months' time and say our building's not performing, we can actually go back and say, well, that's because you haven't been operating it or maintaining it, or we need to change this arrangement of the HVAC or something. So it's about who takes ownership for building performance, I think, in the industry. The other thing, as a tenant, as you will know, Richard, we're just about to sign 2 new leases, one in Wales and one in Reading. And it was very interesting hearing the discussions with some very small local landlords who just don't understand that net zero carbon or the energy performance of their buildings might even be an issue that affects their valuations going forward. So from their point of view, they don't really want to do anything because they want to let the space, as Matthew said, but they don't see energy efficiency as a necessity. So as tenants, back to Alistair's point of individuals, we need to be demanding of our landlords that they have a pathway to net zero. So when we all start looking at space we want to take, then, you know, has that landlord got a way forward for us to achieve all our own net zero carbon ambitions. And the only other one I'd like to end on as a big cry for every sector is let's start acting on the existing building stock. I think everybody sees it as, you know, it's going to be a difficult problem, but nobody's actually starting moving. And there's a few of our clients who we do repeat refurbishment for who are just starting to say, yes, come in, do an energy audit before the refurbishment. And if there's extra stuff we need to add in, which will get us to net zero carbon more effectively, let us know before you start the refurb, and then we'll think about whether we can afford to put it in the budget now. So I guess my final thing is let's start acting now.
Well, that's perfect, Debbie. And what I want to do before we get to the audience questions is a quick fire round, if you like. So I'll give you each a sentence or two, no more than a minute. And it's exactly on your ending point there, Debbie, which is, you know, it's obvious to all of us that we're behind the curve already, and there's a lot to do. So what is the thing that each of you thinks or hopes can happen in the immediate future to really accelerate our journey to net zero? So what should we absolutely be focused on now? And if Matthew, if I pick on you first, just a sentence or two.
I think what is key is that for each and every asset, we come to an action plan. So having a carbon footprint, current carbon footprint, and a pathway to get to the net zero or the zero or close to the zero, that has to come in place for each and every asset. Great.
And Alistair, what would the advice be from UKGBC?
Well, I'm going to make unlikely for me, but a very real world plea, which is that actually at the moment BEIS are consulting on performance-based rating scheme up until the 9th of June. So the plan is to introduce mandatory performance-based ratings for all non-domestic buildings starting in 2022 with large offices. And so building owners and large tenants would be required to measure and publicly report annually on their building's energy consumption, which, you know, is what we've been crying out for, many of us, for well over a decade. And finally, it's back on paper, and it might happen. So that might actually happen. So let's all put in our responses and say why it's good. And of course, we will be responding as UKGBC, but let's show support for that.
Okay, great. Debbie, if I come to you.
Thanks, Richard. I'm going to follow on from Alistair because he stole my one of compulsory energy labelling of all existing buildings. We've worked on this together for a number of years. On a similar vein, I would add that we're also reviewing our Part L of the building regulations, which is the conservation of fuel and power. And the latest I'd heard is that we still weren't going to make it compulsory for all new buildings to have a net zero carbon design. So similarly, that consultation is still out for comment, and we need to make sure really soon that any new building built has to be built to achieve net zero. So I think that's my one I go for.
Okay, great. And finally, Jane, if I can come to you.
I would say that we need to have that community of practice in place. Everybody has a role to play, and this is a shared responsibility and ownership that we all have. So this shouldn't be reliant on the sustainability team.
Fantastic. Okay, well, I'm very conscious of time. We've had an absolute ton of questions through, so I'm just going to try and pick on a few, if that's okay. So let's see what we've got here. So question, do you agree that certain tools that are part of digital twins technology can be of help in regards of building performance monitoring? And the person that's asked the question said, in their opinion, it also makes sense to monitor the behaviour of the existing buildings versus the design. Debbie, I'm naturally thinking of you on this question.
Yeah, definitely. Thanks, Richard. I'm actually championing something across ISG we're calling performing places. And this is very much monitoring the performance of our net zero carbon buildings that have been designed to be net zero against operation. there's a couple things that need to go to achieve the ultimate digital twin. We need to be able to input live data back into the thermal model, the IES and the TAS models, and we're hoping to soon work with IES or TAS to do this. And then we can actually get live energy targets based on the actual occupancy and the actual weather conditions to say how much a building should be using instantaneously. We can then compare that to meters and give alerts on people's phones if buildings are out of kilter with their design performance. It might be for a real reason, but it might be because somebody left the lights on from the event last night, or somebody's opened the window and left the heating on. So I totally agree with whoever asked that question. It is the way forward, but just a word of caution is that I know from running large portfolios of buildings that we can't yet maintain a simple outdoor air sensor. You know, the property management industry are not geared up for performance in use operation, and I've said that publicly a number of times, and that's because building owners and occupiers don't understand they have to pay more probably for maintenance, but they will save more in energy use. So let's all gear up to get these buildings performing.
Does anyone on the panel want to add to what Debbie has said? Silence is golden. So I've got a couple of other questions I'd like to try and cram in. This one might be for you, Matthew. It's has the panel seen good practice when leveraging in green investment from overseas into UK projects?
So is that referring to capital flowing into it, UK, but then specifically targeting greening assets?
Yes, I think so, yes.
Well, I haven't witnessed that in particular. Funny enough, I was talking to a more value-add manager today, and he was thinking of, you know, more focusing on KPIs that would indeed prove that a building has been, you know, improved. For him to allow value-add lending. So something typical American to lend for these value-add funds now then turns into, okay, we're going to focus specifically on KPIs that prove that a building has improved, because they feel that is less risky than not doing it. So there won't be a lower interest rate on that lending, but they will well, there will be an incentive for the manager to improve on these KPIs. So that I find interesting, that it's not only the core lending market, but also more the value-add lending funds that also start to focus on this. Encouraging.
Great, yeah, and that's very encouraging. This is a question that anyone could have a view on. This change is obviously going to take a lot of resource, including money. How do you think the pandemic, where there's less occupancy and the rates may go lower, is going to affect the possibility of implementing these changes? Maybe if I direct that one first to you, Jane.
It's a very good question. I think we're in a very beneficial position because we are long-term landowners, and so therefore what we can do is look to sort of invest longer term into our assets. But I think we do feel that in order for to avoid obsolescence and stranded assets, we do have to invest. And I think for us, it's not just about energy efficient buildings, but it's about creating destinations. So it's thinking about places more broadly than just kind of what's within buildings. And that's what we think will help to kind of retain and attract occupiers. And I think it's also understanding how occupiers will change the way that space is being used. So how do we make sure that buildings are flexible to accommodate different ways of working, etc., in the long term, so that again our buildings are here for 50, 60 years to come, or even and hopefully even longer, and sort of not looking sort of at the immediate sort of impacts of what the pandemic is bringing from an economic point of view.
Fantastic, thank you, Jane. And a question, maybe I'll direct this one to Alistair. Are we looking at ourselves as an industry and the supply chain? I'm watching this, sitting in a very large site, accommodation with fluorescent tubes. By now, I would expect LED. Are we really demonstrating as an industry our commitment to saving energy?
Well, perhaps one of those difficult questions needs to come into play there of talking to your colleagues about who's put that on-site building there and can we change it out. But I think on a broader scale, again, it's super important, yes, that we essentially walk the walk, isn't it? So one way that we're doing that, and thanks for teeing this up without me asking, is that we are recommending to our members and industry, and in fact we've got 2 events tomorrow on this, one specifically for large occupiers, which is to sign up to the World Green Building Council's net zero carbon buildings commitment. And we've got about 50 of our UK members now have signed up to that, as well over 100 worldwide, and that is that by 2030 all the buildings that you operate as an occupier that you have control over will be net zero carbon. So I think, again, if we can do that as an industry, that really shows that it's not just about supply chain expectations, up and down that, but actually ourselves as businesses, we will do that. And I think that will also make us focus on where we're using energy. And there's a really interesting comment as well related to COVID in the questions about what does this mean. I mean, look at where we're all sitting now. Most of us are in homes. What does that mean for our corporate carbon footprints? And we're going to go from dealing with, I don't know, 10 offices as organizations to dealing with 300-400 homes that are offices. And so building on the conversation that Jane was just having, there's some really complex issues that are coming out as this hopefully it's going to be a post-COVID world. I think just to finish on a really positive note is that we were really worried a year ago that all of this that we've been talking about today would just disappear off the agenda, and that businesses especially would really just hunker down and look kind of short term, how are we going to get through what's in front of us today in terms of the impact of COVID, which is, cannot underestimate it on personally and on organizations as well. But what's been fantastic is that hasn't happened at all. We've grown from about 450 to 550 members, and we're seeing so much appetite to actually move forward on this through the last year. And I think it is a bit of a reset, and companies and leaders have been forced to think about the future now and given the opportunity to do things differently and forge a different path. And this is sort of the time to really grasp that and make that a reality, and not just go back to where we were 12 plus months ago.
Yeah, great. We've got about a minute before I need to wrap up, but we've just had another question in that I'd quite like to pose. Thanks for that, Alistair. The webinar hasn't mentioned the financial incentives to introduce net zero technologies. Is this something that needs to be introduced to ensure that financing is not a hurdle? And how can there be a collaborative effort from all of the stakeholders mentioned? So I don't know whether that's a Debbie or a Matthew question.
Yeah, I don't mind starting to take it, Richard. I think it's a really good question, and to be slightly controversial, I think we are almost at the point now where the market has to get on and try and deliver this. We've had lots of financial incentives in the past, particularly to do with solar, which you can take a view on whether they actually worked, but what we really need now is to innovate across the market. And to what Matthew said earlier, we need money to actually do this. So I always get told off for being pessimistic because of the cost that it's going to take to upgrade our existing buildings. But if we understand that and we understand the money involved, I think financing will come forward, whether it's from the private funds and the private markets. We can find a way of defining KPIs, as Matthew said, and then allow investors to invest to achieve that for a certain return, we could start getting the financial sort of incentives in the market working within market forces. And, you know, it would be a brave person who starts putting money in upgrading buildings to net zero and only gets paid when those buildings are performing to net zero.
Fantastic. Is there anything you want to add, Matthew?
Yeah, I think one relevant thing to add is that, well, of course, I feel, you know, every landlord is responsible for improving the building he or she is owning. So that is the first group I would look for capital. One new source of capital I see arising is the so-called impact investing funds. Now we're about to launch our first impact investing fund soon, which is called Sustainable Communities. That is focused on creating affordable housing. So that's new build, because that product still has to be delivered to the market, unfortunately. But there's also within the strategy a large focus on improving buildings. So buying brown buildings and simply improve them and manage them properly. So that dual return, so not only financial return, but also social and environmental return, is part of that impact investing strategy. I see not only us, you know, coming up with investment strategies tailored to that, but also big players like a Brookfield or a KKR that have raised billions for their impact investing funds. Now, I do hope that that will also flow into the real estate market and looking to improve these real assets.
Brilliant, thank you. Okay, so I need to wrap up. We're nearly out of time and just talk about next steps. So first of all, thank you to the panel. Great insight from everyone on the panel. And a big thank you for everyone that's attended today. We did have hundreds of people sign up, so that's great. Some common themes coming through: the need for clear data sets and the need for collaboration, the need to consider these things right across the life cycle, from design through to construction, and then the life of the building. So what happens next? We're going to follow this session by sending you the full report. So you will each get a copy of the Sustainable Buildings Monitor, and that will come in a follow-up communication to you. You'll get a link to the recording today, and if you've got questions, we didn't get through all of them, but if you've got burning questions, then please, you know, do send them through to us. We'd love to hear from you. The best way to get through to us is simply at email@isglimited.com. Sorry, that's email@isgltd.com. I do hope you found the discussion interesting and thought-provoking. But for now, however, do take care, everybody. Stay safe, keep well, and all the very best. Thank you.